The summer heat of 1941 hung heavy over Tuskegee, Alabama, like a wool blanket soaked in humidity. In a small, hastily constructed airfield on the outskirts of town, a group of young African-American men stood at attention under the scorching sun, their eyes fixed forward, their backs straight despite the sweat streaming down their faces. They were dressed in crisp uniforms that somehow felt both too new and already worn by the weight of history pressing down on their shoulders. These men were about to become part of what the United States Army Air Corps called an experiment. The term itself was loaded with condescension, dripping with the assumption of inevitable failure. Could Negro pilots, as they were called in the parlance of the time, handle the complexities of modern aerial combat? Could they master the sophisticated machinery of war, the lightning-fast reflexes required, the split-second decisions that meant life or death at 20,000 feet? The questions themselves were insults wrapped in bureaucratic language, born from the poisonous soil of institutional racism that infected every corner of American society. But these young men standing in formation didn't flinch. They had heard the doubts, the sneers, the casual dismissals their entire lives. They had grown up in a nation that simultaneously demanded their loyalty while denying them basic dignity. Now they would prove something that should never have needed proving. That courage, skill, and honor recognized no color line. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr. stood before them, the first African-American to command such a unit in the history of the United States military. At 30 years old, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had spent his entire life breaking through barriers that were never meant to be broken. The son of the Army's first black general, Davis had endured 4 years of complete silence at West Point, where white cadets had enforced a brutal code of ostracism against him. Not a single classmate spoke to him outside of official duties for his entire tenure at the academy. Yet here he stood, unbroken, his jaw set with determination that had been forged in that crucible of isolation. He would lead these men not just into combat, but into history itself. "Gentlemen," Davis began, his voice carrying across the field with quiet authority, "they expect us to fail. The politicians in Washington debate whether we possess the intelligence for aerial combat. The generals question whether we have the courage. The newspapers print editorials wondering if taxpayer money is being wasted on this experiment." He paused, letting the word hang in the air like smoke from a crash site. "We will give them our answer not with words, but with deeds. Not with protests, but with precision. Not with anger, but with excellence. Every flight, every mission, every moment in the air will be our testimony. We will write our response across the skies of Europe, and it will be written in a language that even our most stubborn critics cannot misunderstand." The seeds of this moment had been planted years earlier, cultivated by activists and advocates who refused to accept the military's color barrier. The NAACP, black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender, and determined individuals like labor leader A. Philip Randolph had pushed, prodded, and pressured the Roosevelt administration. As America edged closer to war in the early 1940s, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. How could America fight fascism abroad while practicing apartheid at home? The Tuskegee program was the military's grudging answer, a compromise designed more to quiet criticism than to truly integrate the armed forces. If these pilots succeeded, perhaps the military would have to reconsider its policies. If they failed, as many expected, it would provide scientific justification for continued segregation. Everything about the program was designed to be separate. While white pilots trained at established facilities with modern equipment and experienced instructors, the Tuskegee Airmen would train at a hastily constructed facility in the heart of Jim Crow, Alabama. The base itself existed in a bizarre twilight zone, federal property where different rules theoretically applied, surrounded by a town where African Americans couldn't drink from the same water fountains, eat at the same restaurants, or walk through the front doors of most establishments. The first class of cadets arrived in July 1941, 5 months before Pearl Harbor would drag America fully into World War II. Captain Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was among them, along with men from diverse backgrounds united by their determination to fly. There were college graduates and sharecroppers' sons, Northerners who had tasted limited freedom and Southerners who had navigated Jim Crow their entire lives. Some came from families of means. Others had scraped together every penny to get this far. What they all shared was a dream that had been deemed impossible for men who looked like them. The training was deliberately grueling. Primary instructor Charles "Chief" Anderson, already a legendary figure in black aviation circles, pushed the cadets relentlessly. Anderson himself embodied the kind of excellence that demolished racist assumptions. He had logged more than 3,500 flight hours when most white instructors had fewer than 1,000. He had taught himself to fly when no white instructor would accept a black student, purchasing his own plane and learning through trial, error, and sheer determination. In 1939, Anderson had taken First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt for a flight during her visit to Tuskegee Institute, a publicity moment that helped build momentum for the Army program. The photograph of Mrs. Roosevelt emerging from the plane with a delighted smile had done more to challenge assumptions than 1,000 editorials. Now Anderson trained these cadets with a fierce dedication that bordered on obsession. He knew that every failure would be magnified, every mistake used as evidence against the entire race. The margin for error was non-existent. "You will be better than good," Anderson told them during their first briefing. "Good will get you killed and get this program canceled. You must be perfect. You must be twice as skilled as any white pilot to be considered half as competent. That's not fair, that's not right, but that's reality. Accept it, embrace it, and exceed it." The cadets absorbed this truth without complaint. They had lived it their entire lives. The physical training was punishing. Endless runs in Alabama heat, calisthenics until muscles screamed, obstacle courses designed to break both body and spirit. But the real crucible was in the air. Flying a trainer aircraft required coordination, spatial awareness, and a kind of instinctive understanding that couldn't be taught, only discovered. The cadets learned to read instruments, while processing a dozen inputs simultaneously, to think in 3 dimensions while making calculations that meant the difference between a perfect landing and a fatal crash. The washout rate was high, as it was at every pilot training program. But here, every failure carried extra weight. Would this be used as evidence that the entire program was a mistake? By March 1942, the first class of Tuskegee cadets had earned their wings. Captain Benjamin O. Davis Jr. and 4 others, Lemuel Custis, Charles Debo, Mac Ross, and George Roberts, became the first African-American military pilots in United States history. The ceremony was small, almost intimate, but its significance reverberated far beyond the modest airfield in Alabama. Black newspapers heralded the achievement with bold headlines. In barbershops and churches, in pool halls and parlors across Black America, people who had never met these 5 men felt pride surge through them. Here was proof, tangible and irrefutable, that the lies about inferiority were just that, lies. But the celebration was tempered by reality. Having wings didn't mean having a mission. The War Department, still deeply ambivalent about the entire program, had no clear plan for how to actually use black pilots in combat. For months, the newly minted aviators languished in a frustrating limbo, training but not deploying, ready but not called. The 99th Fighter Squadron was officially activated in March 1941, but it wouldn't see combat for more than 2 years. During that time, more cadets completed training, swelling the ranks. They practiced formation flying, aerial gunnery, and combat tactics. They learned to handle the P-40 Warhawk, a fighter plane that was already becoming obsolete, but was deemed good enough for the experiment. The frustration was palpable. While America fought across 2 oceans, while white pilots earned medals and glory, the Tuskegee Airmen sat on the ground, their skills wasting, their potential unrealized. Some critics pointed to this delay as evidence that the program had been a token gesture all along, a way to quiet activists without any genuine intention of putting black pilots in combat. Finally, in April 1943, the 99th Fighter Squadron shipped out to North Africa. They arrived in Morocco and began flying missions in support of the Allied campaign to drive Axis forces from the continent. Major Davis, now promoted, led the squadron with the same quiet determination that had sustained him through West Point's ostracism. Their first combat missions were escort duty and strafing runs, dangerous work that required precision and nerves of steel. Flying low over enemy positions, the pilots faced intense anti-aircraft fire. The German gunners didn't care about the color of the pilots above them. Their flak was colorblind even if the American military wasn't. Lieutenant Charles Hall scored the squadron's first aerial victory on July 2, 1943, shooting down a German Focke-Wulf FW-190 over Sicily. The kill was confirmed, photographed, and celebrated, proof that black pilots could match German aces in mortal combat. But the victories came with losses. The 99th suffered casualties, as every combat unit did. Each death hit hard, not just for the personal loss but for the political implications. Critics seized on the losses as evidence of inadequacy, conveniently ignoring that white squadrons suffered similar or higher casualty rates. The squadron faced another, more insidious enemy: racism within their own military. Some white commanders questioned their courage, filing reports that suggested the black pilots weren't aggressive enough, weren't scoring enough kills, weren't living up to standards. These accusations, based more on prejudice than performance metrics, threatened to derail the entire program. Colonel Davis was recalled to Washington in September 1943 to defend his men before a military committee. It was a surreal inquisition, a decorated combat commander forced to justify the bravery of pilots who were dodging bullets over enemy territory while their critics sat safely behind desks thousands of miles from danger. Davis presented the facts with clinical precision. The 99th's mission success rate matched or exceeded comparable white squadrons. Their loss ratio was within normal parameters. They had destroyed enemy aircraft, supported ground troops, and accomplished every objective assigned to them. The problem wasn't performance. It was perception filtered through the distorting lens of racism. The committee's verdict was ultimately favorable, though lukewarm. The 99th Fighter Squadron would continue operations. But the incident left a bitter taste. These men were fighting two wars simultaneously, one against the Nazis, another against the prejudice of their own countrymen. Part 3. The Red Tails Rise. As 1943 turned to 1944, the Tuskegee program expanded dramatically. The success of the 99th Fighter Squadron, despite attempts to undermine it, had proven the viability of black combat pilots. 3 additional squadrons were formed: the 100th, 301st, and 302nd, and combined with the 99th to create the 332nd Fighter Group. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was given command of the entire group, becoming one of the youngest full colonels in the Army Air Forces and the first African American to command a fighter group. The appointment was both recognition of his leadership and a calculated decision by the military brass. If the 332nd was going to succeed or fail, it would do so under black leadership, eliminating any excuses on either side. The 332nd deployed to Italy in early 1944, based at Ramitelli Airfield near the Adriatic coast. From here, they would fly missions deep into the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe, facing the best pilots and most sophisticated air defenses that Germany could muster. It was during this period that the Tuskegee Airmen adopted the distinctive markings that would become their legend. The tails of their aircraft were painted bright red, a bold, unmistakable identifier that announced their presence in the sky. Some accounts suggest the red tails were chosen for practical reasons, to help pilots quickly identify friendly aircraft in the chaos of combat. Others maintain it was a deliberate statement, a refusal to hide or blend in, a declaration that black pilots were here and would not be ignored. Whatever the origin, the red tails became iconic. American bomber crews, initially skeptical about being escorted by black pilots, began to request them specifically. Word spread through the bomber squadrons. If you saw red tails on your escorts, you were going to make it home. The 332nd's primary mission was bomber escort, possibly the most challenging assignment in aerial warfare. Strategic bombing was the Allied plan to cripple Nazi Germany's war industry, targeting factories, railroads, oil refineries, and other critical infrastructure. Massive formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators would fly deep into German territory in broad daylight, their bomb bays loaded with explosives, their crews exposed to both fighter attack and anti-aircraft fire. German fighter pilots developed devastatingly effective tactics to destroy these bombers. They would strike from above and below, targeting the vulnerable nose and belly. They would coordinate attacks to overwhelm fighter escorts, drawing them away so other German fighters could savage the bombers. A B-17 could take tremendous punishment and keep flying, but a well-placed burst from German cannons could turn one into a flaming coffin in seconds. The bomber crews lived with constant fear. They had to fly straight and level on bombing runs, maintaining formation while flak burst around them and fighters bore in for the kill. Many crews didn't survive their required 25 missions. The life expectancy of a bomber crewman was measured in weeks. Fighter escorts provided the only protection, and the quality of that escort meant everything. Some fighter squadrons prioritized aerial victories, peeling off to chase German fighters, racking up individual kill counts while bombers were left vulnerable. The glory went to the pilots with the most confirmed kills, the aces whose names appeared in newspapers. The Red Tails took a different approach, one that would define their legacy. Colonel Davis issued clear orders. Stick with the bombers. No matter how tempting the targets, no matter how many German fighters appeared, the mission was to protect the bombers. Individual glory was secondary to mission success. An ace who shot down 5 enemy fighters while losing 3 bombers was a failure. A pilot who stayed with the formation, shooting down only 1 attacker but ensuring all bombers returned safely, was a success. This philosophy ran counter to the prevailing fighter-pilot culture, which celebrated individual achievement and daring. But Davis understood something deeper. The 332nd wasn't just fighting a military battle. They were fighting for the future of integration in the armed forces. Every bomber they brought home safely was a victory not just for the war effort, but for the cause of equality. The Red Tails developed tactics to implement this strategy. They would fly in tight formation with the bombers, positioned to intercept any attacking fighters before they could reach the vulnerable aircraft. They would coordinate their movements, ensuring overlapping fields of fire and mutual support. When German fighters dove on the formation, the Red Tails would meet them head-on, turning defense into counterattack. The results were extraordinary. Bomber crews began to notice that missions escorted by the Red Tails had dramatically lower loss rates. The 332nd compiled a record that would become legendary. In over 200 escort missions, they never lost a bomber to enemy fighters. That statement requires context. No escort squadron could guarantee complete protection. A lucky shot from a German cannon, a mechanical failure, flak damage causing a bomber to drop out of formation, these things happened. Bombers were lost on missions the Red Tails flew. But those losses came from anti-aircraft fire or mechanical issues, not from German fighter attacks. When it came to protecting bombers from aerial assault, the Red Tails were unmatched. Before the Red Tails became legend, before the bomber crews sang their praises, the pilots of the 332nd had to prove themselves in one of the most brutal aerial campaigns of the war, the Battle of Anzio. In January 1944, Allied forces launched Operation Shingle, an amphibious assault at Anzio intended to outflank German defensive lines and speed the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula toward Rome. The operation, which was supposed to be a swift breakthrough, instead became a grinding stalemate. German forces surrounded the beachhead, pouring artillery and aircraft into the narrow perimeter where Allied troops were pinned down. The skies over Anzio became a killing field. German fighters and bombers attacked constantly, trying to destroy the ships supplying the beachhead and the troops desperately holding the perimeter. Allied aircraft flew continuous missions to protect the ground forces and maintain air superiority. The 99th Fighter Squadron, operating independently before the formation of the 332nd Fighter Group, was thrown into this cauldron. Day after day, they flew patrol and ground attack missions, engaging German aircraft in vicious dogfights while dodging intense anti-aircraft fire from the ground. On January 27, 1944, the 99th faced a major German assault. Lieutenant Clarence "Lucky" Lester encountered a formation of German aircraft and dove to attack, shooting down 3 enemy fighters in a single mission, an incredibly rare achievement that marked him as an emerging ace. The next day, Captain Charles Hall and other pilots from the 99th engaged in a running battle with German FW-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s, shooting down multiple attackers and breaking up the enemy formation before they could reach Allied positions. The fighting was intense and personal. At the speeds combat occurred, pilots could see their enemies' faces through cockpit glass. They could see the moment their bullets found their mark, see the smoke and fire, sometimes see the pilot struggling to escape a doomed aircraft. There was no room for hesitation, no time for second thoughts. Kill or be killed, the oldest law of warfare playing out at 300 miles per hour. Lieutenant Robert Deis recalled one mission over Anzio where he found himself alone, separated from his flight, with 2 German fighters on his tail. I could hear the bullets hitting my plane, see the holes appearing in my wing. I pushed that P-40 to its limits, diving, rolling, pulling maneuvers that should have torn the plane apart. I don't know if it was skill or luck or prayer, but I made it back. My crew chief counted 72 bullet holes in my aircraft. The 99th's performance over Anzio silenced many critics. They had flown more missions than any other fighter squadron in the theater during that period. They had scored consistent aerial victories and provided crucial ground support. Generals who had questioned their courage now requested them specifically for the most dangerous assignments. But the vindication came at a cost. Several pilots were killed or captured during the Anzio campaign. Lieutenant Samuel Bruce was shot down and spent the rest of the war in a German POW camp. Lieutenant Robert Deis, despite surviving his 72-hole mission, was killed 2 weeks later when ground fire brought down his plane. Each loss reminded the survivors that they were mortal, that skill and determination couldn't guarantee survival. They mourned their fallen comrades, then climbed back into their cockpits and flew the next mission. There was no alternative. The war demanded their service, and they had committed themselves not just to victory over Germany, but to proving something larger. In the summer of 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group transitioned to the P-51 Mustang, one of the finest fighter aircraft of World War II. The Mustang was a revelation, faster, more maneuverable, and with far greater range than the P-40 Warhawks the squadrons had been flying. With external fuel tanks, the P-51 could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a distance that had been impossible with earlier fighters. The arrival of the Mustangs coincided with the expansion of the strategic bombing campaign. The Allied air forces were intensifying their assault on German industry, flying deeper into enemy territory, targeting the heart of the Nazi war machine. These missions were extraordinarily dangerous. The farther the bombers flew into Germany, the more fighters the Luftwaffe could bring against them and the more concentrated the anti-aircraft defenses. The red tails painted the tails, nose cones, and wing tips of their new Mustangs in their distinctive bright red. The color became their calling card, their brand, their promise to the bomber crews. When bomber pilots looked out their windows and saw those red tails flanking them, they knew they had the best protection the Army Air Forces could provide. Captain Roscoe Brown, a philosophy graduate from Springfield College who would later earn his PhD, described the feeling of flying the Mustang. It was like the difference between riding a mule and riding a thoroughbred racehorse. The P-51 responded to your thoughts almost before you moved the controls. In combat, that responsiveness meant everything. You could turn inside an enemy fighter, could accelerate out of a dive, could climb above them or dive below them. The Mustang gave us the tools. We provided the skill. The Red Tails quickly mastered their new aircraft. They flew long-range escort missions to targets across southern Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and even into Poland. The missions could last 6 to 8 hours, an endurance test that required mental alertness throughout. Pilots had to monitor fuel consumption, maintain formation, stay alert for enemy fighters, navigate by landmarks and dead reckoning, and be ready for combat at any moment. The Germans didn't discriminate in their attacks. Whether the pilots protecting the bombers were white or black didn't matter to the Luftwaffe. They were all targets. In a perverse way, this was perhaps the only arena of true racial equality the Tuskegee Airmen experienced. In combat, skill mattered, courage mattered, quick thinking and accurate shooting mattered. Nothing else. Lieutenant Lee Archer, who would eventually be credited with 4 confirmed kills plus multiple probable victories, described a mission over Austria. We spotted a formation of Messerschmitt Bf 109s setting up to attack our bombers from above. We climbed to intercept them, and suddenly we're in a vertical dogfight, planes climbing and stalling and falling and firing all at once. I got on one's tail and fired a burst that hit his engine. He started smoking and went into a spin. I couldn't follow because another 109 was diving on me. Combat is controlled. Chaos. Everything happening at once, decisions made in fractions of seconds. No time to think, only react. The Red Tails became masters of this chaos. They developed an intuitive understanding of aerial combat tactics, could read a developing fight and position themselves advantageously. They learned to work as a team, coordinating their movements without extensive radio communication, covering each other's blind spots, setting up crossfire traps for attacking German fighters. Their reputation grew with each mission. Bomber crews requested them by name. Some crews refused to fly missions unless the Red Tails were their escort. This was the ultimate vindication, white bomber crews trusting their lives to black pilots, knowing that those pilots would bring them home safely. March 24, 1945, dawned cold and clear over Ramitelli Airfield. The pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group gathered for their pre-mission briefing, coffee cups in hand, knowing this would be no ordinary mission. The target was Berlin itself, the capital of the Third Reich, the black heart of Nazi power. Berlin was the most heavily defended target in Europe. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the city in multiple defensive belts. Luftwaffe fighters were based at multiple airfields around the capital, ready to defend their homeland's center. Flying into Berlin meant running a gauntlet that had claimed countless Allied aircraft. But the strategic imperative was clear. Berlin's factories, rail yards, and government facilities were crucial to Germany's war effort. Destroying them would hasten the war's end. The bombers would go, and the Red Tails would take them there and bring them back. The 332nd launched 61 P-51 Mustangs that morning, one of their largest single-mission deployments. They formed up with the bomber stream, massive formations of B-17s and B-24s stretching for miles across the sky, an aerial armada carrying destruction into the heart of Germany. The flight to Berlin took hours, crossing the Alps, flying over southern Germany toward the capital. The pilots maintained strict radio discipline, scanning the sky constantly for enemy fighters. The bombers droned steadily onward, their crews knowing they were flying toward the Hornets' nest of German air defenses. As the formations approached Berlin, the Luftwaffe rose to meet them. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s attacked in waves, trying to break up the bomber formations. The Red Tails engaged them, and the sky erupted into a swirling dogfight. Then something new appeared. Captain Roscoe Brown, leading a flight of 4 Mustangs, spotted an aircraft unlike anything he had seen before. Sleek, without propellers, moving at impossible speed. A Messerschmitt Me-262, Germany's revolutionary jet fighter. The Me-262 was a glimpse of the future, a quantum leap in aviation technology. Powered by twin jet engines, it could reach speeds of 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the best Allied propeller fighters. Armed with 430mm cannons, it could shred a bomber with a single firing pass. Germany had deployed the Me-262 in limited numbers, and Allied pilots who encountered them quickly learned to respect and fear the jets. In theory, the Me-262 should have been untouchable by propeller fighters like the P-51. Its speed advantage meant it could attack and disengage at will, never having to engage in a turning dogfight where the Mustang's maneuverability might give it an advantage. But theory and combat reality often diverged. Brown watched the Me-262 diving toward the bomber formation and made a split-second calculation. The jet was fast on the straightaway, but it had to slow down to make an accurate attack run on the bombers. If he could anticipate where the jet would be, if he could position his Mustang correctly, he dove, pushing his Mustang to its maximum speed, positioning himself not where the jet was, but where it would be when it lined up its attack. The physics of interception, calculated instinctively, processed by a mind trained through hundreds of hours of combat flying. The Me-262 came into his sights. Brown fired a long burst from his 6.50 caliber machine guns. Tracers reached out across the sky, a stream of bullets intersecting with the jet's flight path. He saw impacts, saw pieces flying off the jet's tail section. The Me-262 staggered, smoke trailing from one engine. It broke off its attack and dove away, trying to use its speed to escape. But the damage was done. The jet crashed near Berlin, becoming one of the few Me-262s shot down in combat. Brown's victory was confirmed. A jet-age fighter brought down by a propeller-driven plane, a triumph of skill and tactical thinking over pure technological superiority. Two other Red Tail pilots, Lieutenant Earl Lane and Lieutenant Charles Brantley, also scored kills against Me-262s during the same mission, an unprecedented achievement. But the individual victories, as impressive as they were, remained secondary to the primary mission. The bombers reached their targets, dropped their ordnance on Berlin's industrial facilities and rail yards, and turned for home. And every single one of those bombers, shepherded by the Red Tails, made it back safely. The Berlin mission became legendary, but it was just one of hundreds of missions the 332nd flew. Day after day, they launched from Ramitelli, climbed to altitude, formed up with bomber streams, and flew into danger. They lost aircraft and pilots. No squadron emerged from the war unscathed, but their overall record remained extraordinary. Numbers tell part of the story of the Red Tails, but only part. Statistics can capture quantity but struggle with quality, can measure outcomes but not the human cost or the broader significance. The 332nd Fighter Group flew 1,578 combat missions and 15,533 sorties. They destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in the air and another 150 on the ground. They damaged or destroyed numerous locomotives, trucks, and other vehicles. They sank a German destroyer with machine gun fire, an almost unbelievable feat that demonstrated both their skill and their willingness to attack any target. But the statistic that defined them, that became their legend, was the bomber protection record, over 200 escort missions without losing a single bomber to enemy fighters. That record requires understanding in context. The previous escort groups flying the same routes and protecting the same bomber types had lost an average of 46 bombers to fighter attack over similar numbers of missions. The difference between 46 losses and 0 losses represented hundreds of lives saved, dozens of aircraft preserved, immeasurable morale boosted among bomber crews. How did they achieve this? The answer lay in philosophy as much as skill. Colonel Davis's insistence on staying with the bombers meant the Red Tails developed tactics specifically for bomber protection rather than pilot glory. They positioned themselves to intercept attacking fighters before those fighters could reach the bombers. They coordinated their movements to provide overlapping coverage. They didn't chase German fighters who broke off attacks, didn't pursue fleeing enemies if it meant leaving bombers vulnerable. This approach cost them individual glory. Red Tail pilots didn't rack up the high kill counts that made headlines. They didn't become household names like White Aces, whose double-digit victory tallies were celebrated in newsreels. But bomber crews knew the truth. The men flying those B-17s and B-24s didn't care about their escorts' kill counts. They cared about getting home alive. The Red Tails earned a nickname from the bomber crews, Red Tail Angels. It was a term of affection and respect, recognition that these pilots stood between the bombers and death. Some bomber crews painted small red tails on their aircraft, a tribute to their protectors. Others kept photographs of the Red Tails, mementos of the men who had saved their lives. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Stewart Jr., who flew 43 combat missions with the 332nd, described the philosophy. We measured success differently. A mission where we shot down 5 enemy fighters but lost 2 bombers was a failure. A mission where we shot down 0 enemy fighters but brought all the bombers home was a complete success. Our job wasn't to be aces. Our job was to be shields. The individual stories behind the statistics reveal the human dimension of this achievement. There was the mission where Lieutenant Wendell Pruitt's guns jammed, but he continued flying formation with the bombers, using his aircraft as a decoy to draw German fighters into the line of fire of his wingmen. There was the time Captain Armour McDaniel, his plane badly damaged by flak, stayed with the formation for an additional hour rather than breaking off to make an emergency landing, ensuring the bombers had full protection until they reached safer airspace. He crash-landed in Allied territory with his fuel gauge reading empty. These acts of dedication, multiplied across hundreds of missions and thousands of sorties, created the Red Tails record. It wasn't luck. It wasn't accident. It was conscious choice, mission after mission, to put duty above glory, protection above personal achievement. While the Red Tails fought over Europe, Their achievements sent ripples across American society. Black newspapers followed their exploits with detailed coverage, celebrating each victory, each successful mission. In churches and community centers, in barbershops and beauty parlors, African Americans discussed the Red Tails with pride. Here was proof, visible and undeniable, that the racial theories underpinning segregation were lies. If black pilots could master the most sophisticated weapons technology of the age, could outfight the elite German Luftwaffe, could compile combat records that matched or exceeded their white counterparts, then what other limitations were really just prejudices masquerading as facts? The military establishment couldn't ignore the evidence. While institutional racism wouldn't disappear overnight, the cracks in the segregation system were widening. The Red Tails' success made it increasingly difficult to justify the policy of racial segregation in the armed forces. Some white bomber crews who had been skeptical, even hostile, toward the idea of black escorts found their prejudices demolished by experience. Lieutenant Colonel William Womack, a B-24 pilot, wrote in his diary, "I admit I had doubts when they told us the colored squadron would be our escort. I'm from Georgia, and I was raised with certain ideas about who could do what. But after 3 missions with the Red Tails, I'd trust them over any other squadron in the theater. They kept us alive when German fighters should have torn us apart. I don't care what color a man is if he's that good at his job." Not everyone changed their minds. Racism proved resilient, able to maintain itself despite contradictory evidence. Some critics claimed the Red Tails' success was exaggerated, that their record was propaganda rather than fact. These accusations were unfounded. The mission records were meticulously documented, the bomber loss rates were independently verified, but prejudice doesn't require facts. What mattered was that enough people saw the truth. Enough bomber crews came home alive because of the Red Tails. Enough military leaders recognized that segregation was wasting talent and limiting effectiveness. Enough politicians felt pressure from constituents who followed the Red Tails' exploits and demanded equal treatment for these heroes. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 with Germany's surrender. The Red Tails flew their last combat mission on April 30, 1945, escorting bombers to targets in Czechoslovakia. When the guns fell silent, the 332nd Fighter Group returned to the United States as one of the most decorated units in the Army Air Forces. They had earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 1 Silver Star, 14 Bronze Stars, 744 Air Medals, and 8 Purple Hearts. 3 pilots, Captain Lee Archer, Captain Roscoe Brown, and Captain Charles Hall, were recognized as aces or near aces, though some historians argue that if all probable kills were confirmed, several more Red Tails would have reached ace status. But the individual awards, as significant as they were, mattered less than the collective achievement. The Tuskegee Airmen had proven that skill and courage knew no racial boundaries. They had shattered the myth of black inferiority through action rather than argument, through deeds rather than words.